Hello again. There has in the last few years emerged the idea that colonialism is some kind of monstrous and unnatural activity which white people, usually the British, engaged in to the detriment of people with darker skins than their own. It's now seen as being almost as bad as the slave trade. This strange perspective has only been made possible by editing history and limiting our study of history to a small part of the world and a few specific centuries. This entails hiding large chunks of the past and ensuring that children in particular are only directed to look at certain bits of history. Let's begin by mentioning something which was until a few years ago routinely taught to school children in Britain. This is that in the space of less than 1,000 years, England was itself colonised no fewer than 3 times. The teaching of history in British schools does not include most of this period now, which means that it's fast fading from the national consciousness. This in turn means that when we hear of colonialism, white people in Britain feel a knee-jerk reaction of guilt because of course they think it's a reference to the crimes which their ancestors inflicted upon Africans and Asians, rather than something which they themselves endured. In 43 AD, the Romans invaded and began colonising Britain, making slaves of many of the population. Then 400 years later the Germans arrived and they in turn colonised England. The Anglo-Saxons and Jutes took over the country and they also made slaves of many of those living here. A few centuries later it was the turn of the Scandinavians known as Vikings. They too colonised England and enslaved the inhabitants. All this, as I say, used to be taught in schools and was common knowledge to everybody. Older viewers will know about Alfred the Great and perhaps remember how he burnt the cakes. Try asking somebody who has just left school these days about King Alfred or mention King Alfred burning the cakes and see if they catch the allusion. They will stare at you uncomprehendingly. The Danish Invasion, you see, is the wrong kind of colonialism and so must not be taught in schools. Anybody remember being taught to recognise Viking place names because they ended in B as in Grimsby or Thorpe as in Scunthorpe? It's the sort of thing that used to happen at school and doesn't anymore. The history of England is a history of colonisation and enslavement, which does not fit easily into the narrative now being advanced. If any people know about the suffering of colonialism, it is the English. Do they moan about it and hold grudges against Italians, Danes and Germans because of what happened centuries ago? They do not. Do they identify themselves as victims because of suffering colonialism in this way? Of course not. There's a further twist to this though, and it's one which will perhaps amuse viewers greatly. That is that the very people who now complain so vociferously about the legacy of colonialism are themselves the descendants of the most aggressive and rapacious colonisers in history, although they hope that nobody will be impolite to talk about that. Alas, politeness has never been among my virtues, and so let me give a brief history of how Africa was colonised and its native inhabitants subjected to genocide. That the descendants of those who carried out such monstrous acts should now try to portray themselves as hard done by is really quite funny. Around 2,500 BC, sub-Saharan Africa was occupied by 3 ethnic groups. In the rainforest of Central Africa lived the Pygmies, who were hunter-gatherers. The east and south of the continent was occupied by members of another ethnicity, the Khoisan, whom we sometimes call Bushmen. These people were light-skinned and had epicanthic eye folds, rather like the Chinese. They too, like the pygmies, were hunter-gatherers. In a small part of West Africa, where today are the countries of Cameroon and Nigeria, lived a much smaller group, the Bantu. These are the people whom we regard today as being typical black Africans. They were not extremely short like the pygmies, nor were they light-skinned like the Khoisan. The Bantu people, who spoke a distinctive language, might only have had a small territory, but they had developed agriculture, which is to say they planted and harvested crops. They were a warlike and aggressive people too. About 2500 BC, for reasons that might have something to do with climate change or other, perhaps it exhausted the fertility of the fields that they ploughed. They didn't have any fertiliser. But at any rate, about that time, the Bantu began expanding outward from their little bit of West Africa and started chopping down the rainforests in which the pygmies lived. They needed more land to cultivate and so wished in turn to turn some of the rainforest into arable land. The pygmies opposed this not unnaturally and were accordingly slaughtered and enslaved. There are not many pygmies left today. That's kind of what genocide does to an ethnic group. The few survivors are either confined to reserves run by the Bantu, a bit like the reservations in which Native Americans were kept, or they are slaves of the Bantu who treat them like pet animals. There are very few pygmies left today because of this. I give links in the description to this video about this terrible state of affairs, lest anybody think that I'm inventing this. Once they'd finished with the pygmies, the Bantu then moved south and east and did the same thing to the land of the Khoisan, killing them and colonising their territory. This colonisation of Africa, combined with slavery and genocide, is of course black history. But one suspects it will not be featuring all that much during Black History Month. This then is how the colonialism racket is worked, and it explains why our children are no longer taught about Alfred the Great and the Anglo-Saxons at school. They hear plenty about the transatlantic slave trade, but not much about the Viking slave trade, which entailed selling English slaves to traders from North Africa. The fact is that colonialism is one of those awful things which all ethnic groups have played at when they get a chance, throughout the whole of history and in every part of the world. It is now being presented as an exclusively white European practice carried out against people of colour. But that's quite absurd. If you examine the British Isles during the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries AD, you will see the inhabitants as the victims of colonialism and slavery. If, on the other hand, you choose to look at West Africa and the Caribbean during the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, then you'll see the British practicing colonialism and slavery against the Bantu. Look instead at Central Africa during a random 3 centuries around 2000 BC, and you will find the Bantu engaged in colonialism and slavery against the pygmies. Which kind of colonialism you see is dictated entirely by which geographical area and historical period you choose to look at. The reason that I describe this as the colonialism racket is that there is currently a concerted effort to persuade people in Britain that their country's colonialism was uniquely awful, and indeed the only real colonialism. This is a lie, and we need to ask ourselves why so many people seem so determined to advance this peculiar and distorted worldview. It is especially pernicious that this is being done in schools now, giving children a very odd view of the past and leading them to hate the history of their own nation. I have explained how the racket is worked, but not why or by whom. I think I need to make a separate video on those subjects. I can't help but wonder, by the way, if we will ever see any black Africans or Caribbeans agonising over the colonialism which their ancestors were guilty of, or trying to make atonement for events which took place centuries before they were born. To be fair, why should they? Any more than white Europeans should do so.